Hello, I am Alexis Veaux. I identify as a Black, queer, feminist, writer, abolitionist, and I am honored to participate in this global queer reading and to share with you brief perspectives on the life and work of Audre Lorde, who identified in her lifetime as a Black, feminist, lesbian, mother, poet, warrior. In light of the current global health pandemic, in light of the pandemic that is white supremacy and racism and the enduring brutal impacts to Blackness, in light of our resistances to homophobic and transphobic persecutions, I believe that Audre Lorde's work is a balm and a reminder that, as she once said, we were never meant to survive. So I'd like to begin by sharing Lorde's poem, A Litany for Survival. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways coming and going, in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward at once, before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who were imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hoped to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. We are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. And the end of that poem, A Litany for Survival, creates the bridge for the beginning of the 14th chapter in my biography of Audre Lorde, warrior poet, a biography of Audre Lorde. And so I'll share just an excerpt of that with you, and looking at what I hoped the biography would teach us. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. Lorde closed her poem, A Litany for Survival. Now, in the 1980s, speaking became defined by her singular position. She had clout no other Black lesbian feminist had. There were times when her speaking out was not only controversial, it was timely. At times, her writing spoke for her audiences far and wide. Other times, she had to undo the speaking she'd done to repair aspects of her private life, both in person and in her journal. In the mid-1980s, Lorde's speaking in person and on paper provoked more complex interpretations of Black women's lives. The National Women's Studies Association convention, or the NWSA, was held on the campus of the University of Connecticut at Stewart in June of 1981 and coincided with the Berkshire Women's History Conference at Vassar College that same month. The program of the Berkshire Women's History Conference sought to focus on broad interpretations of women's history and women's studies, and on the hostility of the world beyond the Berkshires to attempts by feminists to assume their rightful place in academia. The NWSA convention chose as its focus the theme, Women Respond to Racism, a theme that invited acknowledging the necessity for a political struggle and set the stage for several days of confrontational sessions and debates. As Adrienne Rich put it in her opening address, the NWSA chose to address the estrangement, ignorance, fear, anger, and disempowerment created by the institutional racism which saturates all of our lives. Thus focused on racism within the feminist movement, the convention began in controversy. Lorde's keynote address, entitled The Uses of Anger, began by defining racism, then elaborating on the notion of women responding to racism in anger. Citing a list of anecdotal exchanges so as to preclude any perception of her remarks as theoretical, Lorde emphasized specifically her anger at white women and white feminist academics. She questioned whether white academic women truly sought a dialogue on racism, given the attendant class assumptions of the NWSA in its refusal to waiver the registration fee for poor women and women of color. As Lorde allowed, both white women's anger and the anger of women of color were more useful when expressed and translated into action. Moreover, any discussion among them as women about racism necessitated recognizing their anger. Fear of that anger could deflect from the hard work of excavating honesty. Among additional points, Lorde addressed the recognition that the use of the term women of color did not refer to Black women only. She too was learning to honor the right of women to be identified by their own ethnicity and not to conflate differing struggles with racism as identical to her own. In closing, Lord described herself as a lesbian woman of color, not as particularized as her usual longer definition, Black, lesbian, feminist, mother, poet, warrior. The shorter statement reflected both a continuing quest for new spellings of her name and shifting engagements with her other identities. With that description, Lord situated herself within a wider community of women whose faces were other faces of her own. Unemployed mothers who could not feed their children, victims of home abortions or state-sanctioned sterilizations, lesbians who'd chosen not to have children, those closeted within homophobic communities which served as their only life support, women who'd chosen silence over other forms of death, those who were terrified her anger might trigger an explosion of their own. As other faces of herself, all were reminders that the pursuit of individual freedom as feminists harbored the dangers of unquestioned privilege. Speaking from within that broader community, Lord assumed her more recent persona as itinerant preacher, interpreter of the gospel of social justice. Both interpreter and witness as a Black woman writer, she spoke in and through multiple tongues to multiple audiences. Lord's speaking in tongues projected simultaneous discourses of a multiple self, which in turn linked her to Black community, especially poor Black women, to communities of women of color, to a lesbian community, which separated her from heterosexual Black and white women and men, to a discourse as woman, linking her to the gender issues of white women, and to a discourse of racialized gender that separated her from white women. I think another way to think about Lord today is to think about the public conversations we are having about whiteness and privilege and Blackness, and to really think about the ways in which Audre Lorde's work, back in the 1980s in particular, provides the roots for the contemporary conversation. A story of the story of her life, then, this biography begins by situating Lorde's development within the context of her parents' migration from the Caribbean to America, and ends with Lorde's return to the Caribbean, to St. Croix specifically, 2 years after she was diagnosed with metastasized liver cancer. She lived for 6 years beyond the end of her work as a social activist. Although her activism was far from over when she took up residence in St. Croix, the pace of living there provided a needed respite from the warrior life she'd led on the activist front lines of America. I conclude the biography in 1986 rather than in 1992, when she died for significant reasons. Chief among these was my sense of Lorde's spiritual homelessness for much of her life. A self-described Black, lesbian, feminist, mother, poet, warrior, she entered many homes or social movements throughout her life. And yet, until she relocated to the Caribbean, she remained searching each time for a more perfect, more fully accepting homeland. Another primary reason for ending the biography in 1986 was because I didn't want to overemphasize the cancer, beyond what was necessary to explicate her lives up until that time. I had no wish to chronicle the prognostics of a terminal disease. In her final years, Audre Lorde managed complex medical realities with each new bout of hope, despair, emergency, prescription for medication, appointment, surge or absence of energy, refusing all the while to live without art, peace, a political life, and the women she loved. This has been Alexis Veaux for This Way Out.